The cough was a ragged tear, a sound Isabella tried to swallow, but it escaped anyway, rattling through the thin walls of their small, cold apartment. Sophia, barely 8 years old and small for her age, watched her mother from the chipped wooden table, her own supper untouched. Isabella, a woman in her early 30s, tried to smile, a brave, weary curve of her lips that didn't quite reach her eyes. She moved with a practiced slowness, each step a carefully managed effort, her breath often catching a silent struggle Sophia knew wasn't just a silly cold. She heard the hushed whispers of neighbors, the frantic phone calls about mounting medical bills, the quiet despair that clung to every corner of their meager existence. "Don't worry, my love. Mama will be fine. It's just a silly cold," Isabella rasped, pulling a threadbare blanket tighter around her shoulders. But Sophia saw the tremor in her hands, the unnatural flush on her cheeks. Her mother was fading, a beautiful flower wilting before her very eyes, and the world seemed to offer no solutions, only empty promises. Then, hidden beneath a stack of faded letters in a forgotten cookie jar, Sophia found it. 7 crumpled dollars, her secret hoard of pennies and nickels, a fortune in her small hands. It wasn't much, but it was everything. She clutched the money, its worn edges digging in her palm, a fierce, desperate resolve hardening in her wide, expressive eyes. She needed to do something, anything, for her mother. She needed help, and she knew exactly where to find it. She clutched the money, its worn edges digging in her palm, a fierce, desperate resolve hardening in her wide, expressive eyes. She needed to do something, anything, for her mother. She needed help, and she knew exactly where to find it. The $7 felt like a burning coal in her small hand, a weight both crushing and exhilarating. Their apartment, a single room with a tiny, attached kitchen and a bathroom that always smelled faintly of mildew, felt colder than usual that evening. The single bare bulb hanging from the ceiling cast a weak, yellow glow over their meager belongings. A sagging bed, a rickety table, too, mismatched chairs, and a small, scarred chest of drawers that held all their worldly possessions. Sophia watched her mother, Isabella, from the corner of the room, pretending to be absorbed in a worn picture book, but every fiber of her small being was attuned to the sound of Isabella's labored breathing. Her mother had wrapped herself in a thick, faded shawl, despite the mildness of the early autumn evening, and the tremor in her hands was becoming more pronounced, a constant, subtle shake that Sophia had come to recognize as a sign of her mother's increasing weakness. Isabella moved from the small, chipped sink to the stove, her steps slow, deliberate, as if each movement required immense concentration. Her shoulders, usually so strong and straight, were now slightly hunched, a permanent curve of exhaustion. Sophia saw her mother reach for a pot, then hesitate, her hand hovering above it as a sudden, hacking cough ripped through her chest. It was a dry, rasping sound that seemed to tear at Isabella's throat, shaking her entire body. She bent over, her free hand clamping over her mouth, trying to stifle the noise, to hide the violent spasms from her daughter. But Sophia saw the way Isabella's knees buckled slightly, the way she leaned heavily against the counter for support, her face flushed crimson with effort, then paling to an alarming ashen gray. When the fit subsided, Isabella slowly straightened, taking several shallow, gasping breaths, her chest heaving. She wiped her mouth with the back of her hand, a slight smear of something dark, then quickly turned away, hoping Sophia hadn't noticed. But Sophia saw everything. She saw the fear in her mother's eyes, the desperate attempt to maintain a facade of strength. "Don't worry, my love. Mama will be fine. It's just a silly cold," Isabella rasped again, her voice thin and reedy, devoid of its usual warmth. She forced a smile, a brave, brittle thing that didn't quite reach her eyes, which were clouded with a deep, silent anguish. Sophia merely nodded, clutching her book tighter, her own heart a tight knot of worry. She knew it wasn't just a cold. Colds didn't last. For months, didn't steal the light from her mother's eyes, didn't make her too weak to carry. Groceries didn't turn her vibrant laughter into quiet, choked coughs. The apartment walls, thin as paper, seemed to amplify the hushed whispers that sometimes drifted in from the hallway or the frantic, low-toned phone calls Isabella tried to make when she thought Sophia was asleep. Sophia had learned to pretend to be asleep, her small ears straining to catch fragments of conversations that painted a terrifying picture. The treatment's so expensive. She once heard Isabella murmur into the phone, her voice barely a whisper, thick with tears. We don't have enough. I don't know what to do. Another time, it was a neighbor, Mrs. Petrova, her voice heavy with sympathy. Isabella, you must see a specialist. This cough, it sounds much worse. But the cost. I know, my dear, I know. The words, though disjointed and incomplete, coalesced into a chilling understanding in Sophia's young mind. Her mother was sick, very sick, and they had no money to make her better. The thought was a relentless, icy grip around her heart, squeezing the breath from her lungs. She would lie in bed, long after Isabella had finally drifted into a fitful sleep, listening to the wheezing breath, the occasional shuddering cough, and the silent tears would stream down her face, soaking her thin pillow. She felt utterly helpless, a tiny boat adrift in a storm, watching her only anchor slowly slip beneath the waves. Every day, Isabella seemed a little weaker, a little more distant. Her movements became slower, her voice softer, her smiles more strained. Sophia noticed the way her mother would pause at the top of the short flight of stairs leading to their apartment, her hand pressed to her chest, catching her breath. She noticed the untouched food on Isabella's plate, the way her mother would only pick at her meals, pushing small bites around with a fork before sighing and pushing the plate away. Sophia, in turn, often found herself unable to eat, the lump in her throat too big, the worry too heavy in her stomach. She wanted to ask, wanted to demand answers, wanted to beg her mother to get better, but the words always caught. Isabella would simply stroke Sophia's hair, her touch growing lighter, almost translucent, and whisper, "Eat up, my little bird. Grow strong for Mama." The $7, now pressed smooth in her hand, suddenly felt like a lifeline. It wasn't just money, it was hope. It was a tangible thing she could hold, a secret weapon against the unseen enemy that was stealing her mother away. She remembered how she had painstakingly saved each penny, each nickel, each dime she found on the street, or that a kind neighbor would sometimes give her for running a small errand. The cookie jar, a chipped ceramic pig, had been her secret bank, hidden beneath a stack of old magazines in the back of the pantry. She had forgotten about it for weeks, months even, as her world narrowed to the confines of Isabella's illness. But today, while Isabella was resting, a desperate instinct had pulled Sophia to the pantry. Her small fingers had fumbled with the heavy jar, nearly dropping it as she pulled it onto the floor. She had peered inside, expecting to see nothing but dust and crumbs, but then her fingers brushed against something soft and crinkled. She pulled it out, 2 $5 bills, and then, nestled beneath them, a crumpled dollar bill. The $5 bills were a mistake, she realized. They were from Isabella's emergency stash, the one Sophia knew her mother kept for rent, for bread, for the bare necessities. But the single dollar, and then the next, and the next, until she had a total of 7 crumpled, worn bills in her hand. Those were hers, her treasure, her hard-earned, meticulously saved fortune. It wasn't much, not nearly enough for what she understood her mother truly needed, not enough for the specialist or the treatments that sounded so impossibly far away. But in her 8-year-old mind, $7 was a king's ransom. It was a starting point. It was something, A tiny seed of determination, fierce and unyielding, began to bloom in her chest, pushing aside the despair that had threatened to consume her. She couldn't just sit by and watch her mother fade. She couldn't listen to the worried whispers, the choked coughs, the silent tears anymore. She had to act. She had $7, and she had a problem too big for her mother, too big for Mrs. Petrova, too big for anyone. She knew. Sophia looked around their small, quiet apartment, the shadows deepening as the afternoon faded into evening. The air felt heavy, thick with unspoken fears. She needed help. Not just any help, not a doctor who would shake his head and talk about money they didn't have. She needed someone powerful, someone who could fix anything, someone who could make big problems disappear. Her small, innocent mind, shaped by hushed adult conversations and fragments of local legends, began to piece together a desperate, improbable plan. There were stories in their neighborhood, whispers, of people who could make impossible things happen, people who held sway over the streets, who knew how to get what they wanted, no matter the obstacle. People who were feared, yes, but also respected for their ability to deliver results. For a little girl, these were not criminals but figures of almost mythical power. She had heard the name whispered in hushed tones, sometimes with a tremor of fear, sometimes with a hint of awe. The boss. He lived in a big house on the hill, the one with the tall, black gates and the dark, imposing windows. The house children were warned never to approach. But in Sophia's mind, born of desperation and a child's unwavering belief in the fantastical, he wasn't a monster. He was a solution, a powerful man for a powerful problem. With the $7 clutched tight, Sophia decided she would find him. She would ask him for help. Surely, $7 was enough to buy her mother's life back. Surely, he would understand. She had to try. There was no other choice. She would go to the man everyone feared, the one who could make anything happen, and she would pay him everything she had. The sun, a relentless eye in the pale, indifferent sky, beat down on the cramped, winding streets of their neighborhood. Every window was a potential ear, every doorway a stage for the quiet dramas of daily life. Sophia, small and unobtrusive, moved through it all like a shadow, her senses acutely tuned to the currents of adult conversation that drifted on the hot, still air. The desperation for her mother's recovery sharpened her hearing, transforming fragments of speech into pieces of a puzzle only she could solve. She would linger near open windows, drawn by the low hum of voices, her innocent face masking a fierce, almost predatory focus. Old man Tiberio, his face a map of wrinkles and worry, sat on his usual stool outside the bakery, his voice a gravelly murmur as he spoke to his wife, Maria, who leaned out from their second story window, a faded floral apron tied around her waist. "No one messes with Don Rossi," Tiberio said, his gaze sweeping the street as if expecting the very name to conjure an apparition. "He has eyes everywhere." His words, though meant to convey fear and a warning, only fueled Sophia's nascent plan. Eyes everywhere. To a child, this wasn't surveillance, it was omniscience. A king, she thought, would know everything that happened in his kingdom. A king would know about her mother. Further down the street, near the overflowing fruit stand, two women, their hair wrapped in colorful scarves, whispered intently over a pile of ripe peaches. Their voices were softer, more conspiratorial, but the name Don Rossi still cut through the cacophony of street vendors and distant traffic. "But they say if he likes you," one woman murmured, her eyes wide with a mixture of apprehension and grudging respect. "He fixes things. No one questions it." The other woman nodded slowly, a silent acknowledgement of the unspoken power. "He fixes things." The words echoed in Sophia's mind, pure and resonant. Not, "he breaks bones," or "he takes what he wants," but "he fixes things." He was a repairman of impossible problems, a benevolent force whose favor could mend the broken world. In her young, untested heart, she didn't hear the undertone of menace, the chilling implication of what it meant to fix things without question. She heard only hope, a beacon in the encroaching darkness. He would fix her mother. He simply had to. The stories of Don Rossi were woven into the very fabric of their community, a tapestry of rumor and fear, awe and caution. For the adults, he was the shadow that loomed large, the unseen hand that steered the fate of their small, struggling corner of the city. He was the whispered threat, the unspoken agreement, the final authority. But for Sophia, steeped in the innocent logic of childhood, where stories of powerful men often ended with them granting wishes or righting wrongs, Don Rossi was transforming into something else entirely. He was not a gangster, a criminal, or a ruthless boss. He was a figure of almost mythical stature, a modern-day king, or perhaps a benevolent sorcerer, capable of making the impossible possible. He lived in the big house, yes, the one children were told to avoid, but that only made him more like a distant, powerful monarch residing in a castle, removed from the ordinary world. The warnings, the hushed tones, the fearful glances, these were merely signs of his immense power, proof that he could command the very forces of life and death, sickness and health. He was the one who could make big problems disappear, not with violence, but with a wave of his hand, a word, a silent command. Her small hands, still bearing the faint marks of Play-Doh and crayon, clenched, her brow furrowed, in a concentration far beyond her years. The 7 crumpled dollars, tucked away in the deepest corner of her worn, red purse, felt heavy, imbued with the weight of her entire world. This was her treasure, her offering, her key to unlocking Don Rossi's power. She knew, with a certainty that only a child's desperate faith could provide, that this man, this powerful, mysterious Don Rossi, was her last best hope. All the doctors, with their kind but weary eyes, had failed. All the grown-ups, with their shaking heads and hushed words, had given up. But Don Rossi, he couldn't. The plan, though simple in its conception, was monumental in its scope. She would find him. She would go to him, present her offering, and ask for his help. The details of how to find him, or what to say, were still hazy, obscured by the fog of her inexperience, but the unwavering core of the mission burned bright within her. She didn't know exactly where he was, beyond the vague notion of the big house on the hill, a place whispered about more than seen by children. But she would find it. She would follow the whispers, the threads of adult fear and respect, until they led her to his doorstep. The afternoon sun began its slow descent, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, but Sophia barely noticed. Her focus was entirely internal, a whirlwind of anticipation and a burgeoning, unfamiliar courage. She retreated to the small, shared room she occupied with her mother, the air thick with the scent of medicine and fading flowers. Her mother was sleeping, a shallow, restless slumber that offered little true respite. Sophia watched her for a long moment, the rise and fall of her chest almost imperceptible, the pallor of her skin stark against the faded pillowcase. A silent promise formed on Sophia's lips, one she didn't speak aloud for fear of breaking the fragile peace of the room. She would do this for her. She carefully retrieved the $7 from her purse. The rough texture of the paper, worn soft from being clutched so often, felt comforting, a tangible representation of her purpose. She folded the bills meticulously, smoothing out the creases with her small thumb, as if preparing them for an important ceremony. Then, with a practiced motion, she slipped them beneath the front of her simple cotton blouse, pressing them against her skin, directly over her rapidly beating heart. The money felt warm there, a secret kept close, a source of both anxiety and immense strength. It was heavy, not just with its monetary value, but with the weight of her conviction, her absolute belief that this small sum, her entire worldly possession, would be enough to buy back her mother's health. A tremor ran through her, a mixture of fear and exhilaration. Her small frame, usually so light and quick, felt heavy with the gravity of her mission. She straightened her shoulders, a tiny soldier, preparing for battle. The world outside, with its looming shadows and unfamiliar dangers, suddenly seemed vast and intimidating. But the image of her mother's pale face, the memory of her weak cough, pushed aside any nascent doubts. She had to be brave. She had to be strong. She chose her shoes carefully. Her worn canvas sneakers, the ones with the slightly frayed laces, because they were quiet. She didn't want to draw attention. Her hair, usually a tangle of dark curls, she smoothed back with her hands, attempting an air of seriousness she had seen on adults. Her small backpack, typically filled with a coloring book and a tattered doll, remained empty. This journey required no toys, no distractions, only resolve. Taking a deep, shaky breath, Sophia peered out the window. The street below was quieter now, the afternoon bustle giving way to the slower rhythm of early evening. Fewer people were out, making her escape less noticeable. She envisioned the path she would take, a vague mental map formed from overheard conversations and fleeting glimpses from passing buses. The big house was on the hill, which meant uphill, away from the sprawling, crowded tenements. It was a journey into the unknown, a passage into a world that children were explicitly forbidden from entering. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the $7 tucked beneath her blouse. A knot tightened in her stomach, a dizzying mix of apprehension and fierce determination. This was it, the moment of truth. She cast one last glance at her sleeping mother, a silent farewell, a silent promise. Her lips moved, a barely audible whisper, a vow made to herself and to the universe. He will help my mommy, she breathed, her eyes wide and luminous in the fading light, fixed on the distant, unseen street. He has to, with a courage born of pure, unadulterated love and a child's unwavering belief in the fantastical. Sophia turned from the window. Her hand reached for the doorknob, the cold metal a stark contrast to the warmth of the money against her skin. The air in the hallway felt different, heavier, as if acknowledging the monumental step she was about to take. She opened the door, a sliver of light from the setting sun slicing into the dim apartment, and slipped out, a small, solitary figure, embarking on a journey of impossible hope. The creak of the floorboards, the muffled sounds of the building, all faded behind her as she stepped into the echoing silence of the stairwell. Each step down was a step away from the only world she knew, a descent into the intimidating unknown. The dust motes danced in the slivers of light from the landing windows, swirling around her like tiny, silent witnesses to her audacious quest. The scent of stale cooking and damp concrete filled her nostrils, familiar yet suddenly alien. She pushed open the heavy main door of the building, the old wood groaning in protest, and emerged onto the street. The air, still warm from the day's heat, brushed against her face, carrying the distant murmur of the city, a sound that now seemed fraught with peril and possibility. The familiar street, usually a haven of routine, now stretched before her, an intimidating, winding path leading toward the mysterious, feared territory of Don Rossi. Her small feet, encased in their worn canvas, took the first tentative steps onto the cracked pavement, each one a silent prayer, each one a testament to her desperate, unyielding hope. The familiar street, usually a haven of routine, now stretched before her, an intimidating, winding path leading toward the mysterious, feared territory of Don Rossi. Her small feet, encased in their worn canvas, took the first tentative steps onto the cracked pavement, each one a silent prayer, each one a testament to her desperate, unyielding hope. The world around Sophia had shifted the mundane, turning into something ominous and grand. Each block she walked felt longer than the last, the shadows deepening as the sun dipped further below the city skyline, painting the clouds in bruised purples and fiery oranges. The air grew cooler, carrying the scent of exhaust fumes and damp earth, a stark contrast to the familiar smell of her mother's cooking that usually greeted her at this hour. The streetlights flickered to life, casting long, distorted shadows that danced ahead of her, making the familiar urban landscape feel alien and menacing. She clutched the crumpled $7 in, her tiny fist, the edges damp with sweat, its weight a heavy, comforting presence against the rising tide of fear in her chest. Finally, after what felt like an eternity of small, determined steps, she arrived. It wasn't what she expected. There were no flashing neon signs, no ostentatious displays of wealth that might announce a criminal empire. Instead, a discreet, elegant building stood silently, almost blending into the row of upscale establishments that lined this particular street. A restaurant, she realized, its windows dark and opaque, reflecting the city lights like silent, watchful eyes. The facade was made of dark, polished wood and intricate wrought iron, exuding an air of understated luxury that spoke of old money, of secrets held close. A small, tasteful sign, almost hidden by an awning, simply read, Il Leone, the lion. The name itself sent a shiver down her spine, a primal fear of the predator, whose den she was about to invade. This was it, the place her neighbor, Old Man Rizzo, had whispered about, the place where Don Rossi conducted his business, hidden in plain sight. Two figures loomed by the heavy, ornate double doors, their silhouettes broad and imposing against the muted glow from within. There were men built like stone walls, their dark suits tailored perfectly to their massive frames, their expressions unreadable, fixed. They were the gatekeepers, the first line of defense, and their very presence radiated an unspoken warning. Do not approach. Sophia's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the silence of the evening. Her legs felt like jelly, threatening to give out beneath her, but the image of her mother, pale and fragile in her bed, flashed before her eyes, an anchor in the storm of her fear. She swallowed hard, the dryness in her throat making it difficult, but she pushed one foot in front of the other, directly toward the formidable figures. As she drew closer, their imposing height became even more pronounced. They stood like statues, their arms crossed, their gazes sweeping the street with an almost imperceptible vigilance. Neither of them seemed to notice the small, determined girl approaching until she was almost directly in front of them, a tiny dot at the base of their towering forms. One of the men, with a jaw like chiseled rock and eyes that seemed to miss nothing, finally lowered his gaze to her. His brow furrowed, a flicker of something akin to confusion, then annoyance, crossing his features. He leaned down slightly, his voice a low rumble that vibrated through the pavement beneath Sophia's feet. Garatinia, he said, the words heavy and slow, voce neo pod ficar acqui, va para casa. His tone was not unkind, but it carried an unquestionable authority, a clear command. Sophia gripped the money tighter, her small knuckles white. The words, though expected, still struck a fresh wave of terror through her. Her voice, when it came, was a mere whisper, a tremulous thread, against the man's deep baritone, but there was an unyielding firmness beneath it. I need to speak with the Don Rossi, she insisted, her eyes fixed on his, trying to convey the immense urgency that propelled her. It's very important. My mommy, she needs him. She looked up at him, her huge, tear-filled eyes pleading, refusing to be dismissed. She stood her ground, a tiny, defiant sentinel, her small frame radiating a desperate resolve that seemed utterly out of place in front of such formidable men. The second guard, equally massive, now turned his full attention to her, a perplexed expression on his face. They exchanged a quick, bewildered glance, clearly unaccustomed to such an interruption, let alone one from a child. The guards stared at the money, then at each other, their confusion deepening into something almost comical. $7? To see Don Rossi? It was an absurdity, a scene plucked from a child's fantasy. They were accustomed to threats, to demands, to hushed negotiations, not to a small girl offering a paltry sum for a mother's life. The first guard sighed, a heavy sound that seemed to rumble from his very core. He ran a hand over his clean-shaven head, his patience wearing thin, but something in the girl's unwavering gaze, her utter conviction, prevented him from simply forcing her away. He tried reasoning, his voice a little more stern now. Look, kid, the Don is a busy man. He doesn't see just anyone. And he certainly doesn't see little girls with $7. This is a private establishment. You need to leave. Now. But Sophia shook her head, a stubborn, unshakable refusal. I won't, she declared, her voice now surprisingly clear, infused with the pure, unadulterated resolve of a child fighting for the only family she had left. Not until I speak to him. My mommy needs him. I won't leave. She dug her small heels in, planting herself firmly on the elegant paving stones, a tiny, immovable obstacle. She wouldn't let them deter her. She couldn't. This was her only hope. The impasse continued, a silent standoff between unwavering innocence and immovable authority. The two hulking guards found themselves in an unprecedented predicament. They couldn't physically remove a child without drawing unwanted attention, and yet they couldn't allow her to remain. They glanced nervously at the restaurant doors, then back at the girl, a silent debate passing between them. Their prolonged discussion, the strange sight of two enormous men flummoxed by a pint-sized adversary, began to draw a sliver of attention. Not from passers-by, for this street was usually quiet at this hour, but from within the establishment itself. A figure appeared in the shadowed doorway. A man of medium height, impeccably dressed in a dark suit, his movements fluid and precise. This was Marco, Don Rossi's most trusted consigliere, his right-hand man, known for his sharp mind and even sharper temper. He had a natural air of command, a quiet intensity that spoke of years spent navigating treacherous waters. He surveyed the scene with a cool, assessing gaze, his eyes narrowing slightly as he took in the unusual tableau. Two of Don Rossi's most formidable enforcers, looking utterly baffled by a small child. Marco approached, his footsteps soft on the polished floor, but his presence was immediately felt. He stopped a few feet behind the guards, his voice a low, even tone that cut through the hushed street. What in the hell is going on here? He asked, his question directed at the guards, though his eyes were already fixed on Sophia. His initial expression was one of irritation, a minor disruption to the carefully orchestrated order of the evening. The guards immediately straightened their postures, snapping to attention. Marco, the first guard began, a hint of relief in his voice at the arrival of someone who might actually handle this unprecedented situation. This little girl, she's insisting on seeing the Don. Says her mother needs him. Won't leave. He gestured vaguely at Sophia, who stood her ground, her gaze now flicking from the guards to this new, equally intimidating figure. Marco's eyes, sharp and intelligent, met Sophia's. He saw the fear, yes, but also the raw, unwavering determination, a spark of defiance that intrigued him despite himself. A child, alone, at Il Leone, demanding to see Don Rossi? It was unheard of, preposterous, and yet there was something in her gaze that spoke of genuine desperation, not a childish prank. He noticed the slight tremble in her hands, the way she clutched the money, and a flicker of something unreadable crossed his face. Annoyance warred with a rare, almost imperceptible curiosity. Don Rossi did not entertain frivolous requests, especially not from unexpected visitors, and certainly not from children. This was a place of power, of serious business, not a charity. Little girl, Marco said, his voice calmer, more measured than the guards, but no less authoritative. Do you know where you are? This is not a place for games. Sophia lifted her chin, her small face resolute. I know where I am, she said, her voice surprisingly steady. And it's not a game. My mommy is really sick. I need Don Rossi. She held up the crumpled $7 again, a testament to her earnestness. Marco stared at the money, then at her awry, almost imperceptible twist of his lips. $7. The sheer audacity of it, the innocence. It was a remarkable display of courage. Or perhaps utter naivete. He had seen men twice her size crumble under far less pressure. This child, however, stood her ground, her small chin tilted stubbornly upward. He considered the implications. A child causing a scene at the entrance of Don Rossi's establishment, even a discreet one, was not good for business. It attracted unwanted attention. It disrupted the carefully cultivated facade of respectability. He could simply have the guards remove her, forcefully if necessary, but something held him back. There was an almost sacred quality to a child's desperate plea, even one directed at the city's most feared man. And more importantly, he knew Don Rossi. The Don had a strange, unpredictable streak, a fascination with the unusual, a belief that nothing truly happened by chance. This child, appearing here, now, was an anomaly, a glitch in the meticulously ordered universe of their operation. It demanded an explanation, or at the very least, an acknowledgement. Marco pulled a small, sleek radio from his inner jacket pocket, his movements swift and practiced. He spoke into it, his voice barely a whisper, yet clear and precise. Don, he said, his eyes still fixed on Sophia, a flicker of something unreadable in their depths. We have a peculiar situation at the entrance. A child. She insists on seeing you. Claims it's urgent. About her mother. He paused, listening to the crackle of static, then a low, gravelly voice on the other end. Marco's expression remained neutral, but a slight tightening around his eyes suggested he was receiving an unexpected directive. He listened for another moment, then clicked off the radio, tucking it back into his pocket. He turned to the guards, a subtle nod confirming their instructions. Let her in, he commanded, his gaze sweeping over them, then settling back on Sophia. His voice held no warmth, no sympathy, but a stark, undeniable authority. A collective intake of breath, silent and unacknowledged, passed through the small group. The guards looked stunned, their eyes wide with disbelief. A child? In Don Rossi's presence? It was unthinkable. But Marco's word was the Don's word, and they moved aside, their massive forms, creating an unexpected opening into the hushed interior of Il Leone. Sophia, her heart still pounding, felt a surge of both terror and triumph. She had done it. She had passed the first test. But as she looked into the dark, shadowed doorway, the elegant, discreet restaurant now seemed less like a haven and more like a carefully constructed cage, a lion's den indeed. Marco simply stood there, his gaze unblinking, a silent, unmoving guardian. The air shifted, heavy with anticipation, as Sophia, clutching her meager offering, prepared to step across the threshold, into the unknown, into the very heart of the power she sought. Don Rossi, meanwhile, sat in his opulent private study, the faint sounds of the city muffled by thick walls and plush carpets. The unusual interruption, relayed by Marco, had pricked a rare nerve of curiosity within him, a man accustomed to the predictable rhythms of fear and power. A child demanding an audience? Such an anomaly, he knew, never happened without a profound, perhaps even dangerous, reason. He leaned back in his leather chair, a slow, calculated smile spreading across his lips, already wondering what kind of game destiny was playing. The slow, calculated smile that had begun to stretch across Don Rossi's lips was merely a prelude, a silent promise of the intricate game he expected to unfold. He had anticipated a plea, perhaps a desperate negotiation from a trembling adult, someone crushed by the weight of circumstance, seeking his formidable influence. Never, in the long, brutal calculus of his life, had he imagined a child as the catalyst for such an unusual audience, let alone a child who had so audaciously bypassed the usual labyrinthine channels of approach. The soft, distant murmur of the city, a symphony of sirens and hurried footsteps, was completely swallowed by the thick, soundproofed walls of his private study, leaving only the hushed anticipation within. He waited, his posture relaxed, yet every fiber of his being was coiled, observant, ready to dissect the unexpected anomaly that was about to breach his meticulously constructed sanctuary. Outside, the heavy, ornate doors of the private dining room swung inward with a faint, almost reverent sigh, revealing a short, dimly lit corridor. It wasn't merely a hallway. It was a transition, a deliberate passage designed to shed the mundane world and prepare one for the powerful presence. At its end, the air grew heavier here, thick with the scent of aged leather, rich pipe tobacco, and something else, something indefinable that spoke of old money and quiet, absolute authority. Sophia, clutching her 7 crumpled dollars, felt the shift immediately. The restaurant's opulent but public grandeur faded behind her, replaced by a more intimate, almost oppressive luxury. Her small, scuffed shoes seemed to echo too loudly on the polished marble floor, each tiny step a stark contrast to the thick, silently absorbing carpets that lined the hallway further in. Marco, a hulking sado, beside her, moved with a rigid tension, his jaw tight, his eyes darting, assessing the silent guards, who now stood like statues, their gazes fixed forward, betraying nothing. He had vouched for this child, had brought her to the heart of the lion's den, and the weight of that responsibility was palpable in his stiff shoulders. The corridor opened into a vast, cavernous room, the Don's personal office, and Sophia felt her breath catch in her throat. It wasn't merely an office. It was a realm, a testament to wealth and power that dwarfed anything she had ever seen. The room was shrouded in a perpetual twilight, heavy velvet, drapes drawn across tall, arched windows, allowing only slivers of the late afternoon sun to pierce the gloom. The dominant color was a deep, somber mahogany, reflected in the massive desk that occupied the center of the room, polished to a mirror sheen. Towering bookshelves, intricately carved and reaching to the high, coffered ceiling, lined the walls filled not just with books, but with ancient-looking tomes bound in leather, their spines glinting with gold leaf. Priceless works of art, dark and imposing, hung at precise intervals, their subjects often brooding landscapes or stern, unsmiling portraits that seemed to watch Sophia with disquieting intensity. A grand, intricately patterned Persian rug, so thick it muffled even the sound of her own frantic heartbeat, covered the floor, its deep reds and blues barely visible in the dim light. Heavy, wingback chairs upholstered in dark, lustrous leather were arranged around a low, carved coffee table, and a faint, sweet aroma of expensive cigars lingered in the air, cloying and rich. The sheer scale of it all was overwhelming, a stark, almost absurd contrast to Sophia's tiny frame, her worn dress, and the meager $7 clutched in her hand. She felt like a lost sparrow in a dragon's hoard, every object a silent, imposing guardian of secrets and power beyond her comprehension. She could feel the immense weight of the room pressing down on her, the silent judgment of centuries of wealth and influence. Behind the monumental desk, framed by the dark wood and the shadows, sat Don Rossi. He was a figure of quiet, almost terrifying stillness. His suit, impeccably tailored, seemed to absorb the dim light, making him appear as if he were carved from the very shadows that clung to the corners of the room. His face, etched with the lines of countless battles fought and won, was utterly unreadable, a mask of impenetrable calm. His dark eyes, however, were not calm. They were piercing, fixed on Sophia with an intensity that made her skin prickle. He didn't move, didn't gesture, didn't offer a smile or a frown. He simply watched, a silent, all-consuming gaze that seemed to strip away her defenses, laying bare her very soul. To his right, just a step behind his chair, Marco stood like a sentinel, rigid and tense. His usual bravado had vanished, replaced by a palpable apprehension. He glanced nervously between the Don and Sophia, his brow furrowed with a silent plea for the child to handle this delicate, dangerous situation with the utmost care, knowing full well the Don's legendary short temper and his absolute intolerance for foolishness. Marco's heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic drumbeat of dread. He had brought this tiny, fragile lamb into the lion's den, and he could only pray the lion was in a benevolent mood. Sophia, however, was not looking at Marco, nor was she truly seeing the intimidating grandeur of the office. Her gaze, though flickering with trepidation, was locked on the man behind the desk, the legendary Don Rossi himself. She swallowed hard, the dryness in her throat making her voice feel like a distant whisper. Her small hands, sticky with nervous sweat, tightened around the crumpled bills and cold coins. This was it. This was the moment she had traveled through fear and uncertainty. For this was the man who could change everything, with a profound, almost reckless courage that seemed to bloom from the very core of her desperate love for her mother. Sophia took a deep, shaky breath. She took one hesitant step, then another, until she stood before the colossal desk, her chin barely reaching its polished surface, her eyes glistening with unshed tears, but unwavering in their resolve, met Don Rossi's piercing stare. Slowly, deliberately, she extended her hand, placing the paltry offering, the 2 crumpled dollar bills and the handful of clinking quarters, dimes, and nickels, onto the vast, empty expanse of the mahogany. The few coins rattled softly against the wood, a ridiculously small sound in the immense, silent room, a sound that seemed to mock the very idea of its significance. "Mr. Rossi," Sophia began, her voice a reedy whisper at first, then gaining a surprising steadiness as she forced the words past the lump in her throat. Her eyes, though still swimming with unshed tears, held a fierce, unyielding determination. "My mommy is very sick. She coughs all the time, and she can't get out of bed anymore. The doctor said she needs special medicine, but we don't have any money." She paused, her small chest heaving with the effort of holding back a sob. She gestured toward the small pile of money on the desk, her hand trembling slightly. "I have $7. It's all I have. I saved it from doing chores, and from the change Mama sometimes gives me for candy. Please, Mr. Rossi." Her voice broke slightly, but she pushed through it, her unwavering gaze fixed on the Don. "Can you help her get well?" The desperate plea hung in the heavy air, a fragile thread, woven into the fabric of the room's intimidating silence. It was a request so utterly simple, so raw in its innocence, that it seemed to reverberate through the very foundations of the powerful empire Don Rossi had built. A beat of profound silence followed, so deep it felt like the world outside had ceased to exist. Don Rossi's eyes, which had been unblinking, now shifted ever so slightly, a subtle movement that was nonetheless magnified in the stillness. A single eyebrow, dark and precisely groomed, rose by the barest fraction, an almost imperceptible sign of his internal processing. His gaze drifted from Sophia's determined, tear-streaked face to the pitiful pile of currency on his desk, the crumpled bills and tarnished coins looking absurdly small against the dark, polished wood. He slowly, deliberately, leaned back in his chair, the rich leather creaking softly under his weight, the only sound in the room other than the frantic beat of Sophia's own heart. His voice, when it finally came, was a low, resonant murmur, smooth as aged whiskey, yet carrying an edge of iron that made Marco flinch. Marco, standing stiffly beside the Don, felt a jolt of pure dread shoot through him. This was it. The Don's patience, thin at the best of times, was surely about to snap. He had watched countless men, far more powerful than this child, crumble under that icy stare, that deceptively calm voice. His instincts screamed at him to intervene, to shield Sophia from the inevitable wrath, but he knew better than to speak out of turn. He could only manage a strangled whisper, barely audible even to himself, his shock and incredulity at the child's brazenness warring with a sudden, unexpected surge of protectiveness. Don, what? The words were cut short, a futile protest swallowed by the oppressive quiet of the room, unheard by Don Rossi, whose focus remained entirely on the small figure before him. The scene was an impossible tableau. The child, resolute in her desperate faith. The mountain of power, seemingly unmoved, and the silent, horrified observer caught in between. Don Rossi continued to regard Sophia, his gaze unwavering, dissecting her desperate plea, her unwavering courage, and the utterly insignificant sum she had laid before him. He leaned forward. Again, his movements slow, deliberate, each action imbued with a weighty significance. His large, powerful hand, the same hand that had ordered countless fates, that had held the reins of an empire, reached out. His fingers, long and unblemished, closed around the small, crumpled bills and the handful of coins. He lifted them from the desk, letting them settle in the palm of his hand, feeling the surprising weight of the copper and silver, the flimsy texture of the worn paper. He turned them over, examining the familiar faces of Washington and the worn edges of the quarters, as if they held some profound secret. The silence in the room deepened, becoming almost unbearable, charged with an unspoken tension that pulsed like a live wire. Marco held his breath, unable to tear his eyes away from the tableau, his mind racing, trying to anticipate the Don's next move, trying to discern the meaning behind this unprecedented moment. This was not how things happened in Don Rossi's world. This was an anomaly, a breach in the carefully constructed order, and Marco knew that. Anomalies were often met with swift, brutal consequences. But Don Rossi simply sat there, the $7 resting in his open palm, his gaze now sweeping from the money to Sophia's small, hopeful face, then lingering on the worn fabric of her dress. He saw not just a child, but a ghost, a flicker of something long buried, something from a different life, a different time. A faint, almost imperceptible tremor passed through him, a ripple of an emotion he hadn't felt in decades. The weight of the crumpled dollars in his palm suddenly felt heavier than any fortune, heavier than any sin, a strange, unexpected burden that began to stir a distant, almost forgotten memory, a memory of a time before the cold calculus of power, a time when $7 might have meant the world, a memory that would now lead him to a decision no one could have possibly foreseen. The weight of the crumpled dollars in his palm suddenly felt heavier than any fortune, heavier than any sin, a strange, unexpected burden that began to stir a distant, almost forgotten memory, a memory of a time before the cold calculus of power, a time when $7 might have meant the world, a memory that would now lead him to a decision no one could have possibly foreseen. Don Rossi's gaze unfocused, drifting beyond Sophia, beyond the opulent confines of his office, to a faded canvas in his mind. He saw a cramped, dimly lit room, the scent of damp earth and simmering broth clinging to the air like a shroud. A woman, her face etched with a weariness that went beyond simple fatigue, lay on a threadbare cot, her breath rattling in her chest. His mother, feverish, her skin almost translucent. She had whispered about the biting cold, about the doctor she couldn't afford, about the hunger that gnawed at his own small stomach. He remembered the desperate scramble, the frantic, childish search for anything that could ease her suffering. He had found a single, tarnished silver coin, hidden beneath a loose floorboard, a forgotten treasure that felt like a king's ransom in his small, trembling hand. He had clutched it, run through the muddy streets, his tiny legs pumping, believing that this meager sum could buy a miracle. It hadn't. The doctor had scoffed, the pharmacist had turned him away, and the coin had felt like ash in his palm. He had returned to find his mother weaker, her eyes glazed with a resignation that had haunted his dreams. For decades, he had been powerless then, a small boy in a world too vast and cruel, watching the most important person in his life slip away, held captive by the merciless grip of poverty and sickness. The image was sharp, painfully so, cutting through the layers of callus he had built around his heart. It was a wound that had never truly healed, merely scabbed over, festering beneath the surface, driving him to amass the very power he had lacked then, to ensure no one he cared for would ever face such helplessness again. And now, looking at Sophia, so small, so resolute, her eyes burning with an almost identical fire of desperate hope, clutching her meager offering, he saw himself. He saw the child he had been, the boy who would have given anything, done anything for his mother. The flashback receded as quickly as it had come, leaving a faint, bitter taste in his mouth. Don Rossi blinked, his eyes refocusing on Sophia, the present snapping back into sharp, unforgiving clarity. The $7 still rested in his palm, a tangible link to that raw, forgotten past. He felt a tremor, not of fear, but of an unfamiliar emotion, a ripple of something akin to compassion, something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in what felt like a lifetime. He cleared his throat, the sound a low rumble, and Marco flinched, straightening imperceptibly, his eyes still fixed on the dawn, trying to decipher the sudden, profound shift in the room's atmosphere. Don Rossi's voice, when he spoke, was still low, still carried the weight of authority, but it possessed a strange, almost imperceptible softness, a departure from his usual gravelly command. "Tell me, Sophia," he began, his gaze piercing, yet not unkind. "Your mother, Isabella, what kind of woman is she?" The unexpected question caught Sophia by surprise. Her small shoulders hitched, and she blinked, her initial hope momentarily clouded by confusion. She hadn't anticipated a query about her mother's character. She had expected a verdict on the money, a decision on whether her desperate plea would be heard. But then, as she looked into Don Rossi's dark, unblinking eyes, she understood. He wasn't just looking at her. He was looking through her, trying to see the woman she was fighting for. Her voice, though still tinged with the tremor of a child facing an imposing figure, gained new strength, a fierce protectiveness. "My mama," Sophia began, her chin lifting slightly. "She is the strongest woman in the whole world. She works 2 jobs, sometimes 3, even when she's hurting. She always makes sure I have enough to eat, even if she doesn't. She tries to hide it, but I see her. She's proud, Mr. Rossi. Too proud to ask for help, even when she's really sick. She always says, 'We stand on our own 2 feet, Sophia.' She worries about what people will think. She worries about being a burden." Sophia's voice faltered slightly, her eyes welling up with unshed tears. "She doesn't want anyone to see her like this. She wants to be strong for me." The words tumbled out, raw and honest, a testament to the fierce love and admiration she held for Isabella. She wasn't just describing a mother. She was describing a hero, a woman of unyielding dignity, battling against overwhelming odds, trying to maintain a facade of strength for her child. Don Rossi listened, his expression unreadable, but his eyes, those dark pools that rarely betrayed. Emotion seemed to soften further, if only by a fraction. He watched Sophia's small hands clench and unclench, her posture stiff with conviction, and he saw the echoes of Isabella's pride in her daughter's fierce loyalty. He saw the truth in her words, the genuine adoration and deep understanding of her mother's character. This wasn't a rehearsed plea. It was the heartfelt testimony of a child who knew her mother's soul. He understood that pride, that stubborn refusal to ask for help. He understood the burden of appearances, the need to maintain a certain image, especially when the world was watching, waiting for a sign of weakness. Isabella, he mused, was a woman of substance, a woman whose dignity, much like his own reputation, was paramount. He couldn't simply send a doctor, or worse, a bag of money to her door. That would be an insult, a blow to the very pride Sophia had just described. No, his help had to be subtle, indirect, a whisper in the wind, a solution that appeared to be nothing more than a turn of good fortune, a stroke of luck, or perhaps the unseen hand of a powerful, benevolent, yet terrifying force. He needed to help Isabella without her ever knowing she was being helped by the infamous Don Rossi. He needed to preserve her dignity, even as he ensured her survival. The decision solidified in his mind, a cold, calculated plan, forming in the shadows of his compassion. He would help, yes, but in his own way, a way that would leave no doubt about his power, but also no trace of his direct involvement. It would be a ghost of an intervention, a phantom act of kindness, perfectly aligned with the enigma he cultivated. Marco, still standing rigid, a silent sentinel by the door, watched the almost imperceptible changes in his Don's demeanor. He had known Don Rossi for decades, had seen him execute rivals without a flicker of remorse, had watched him dismantle businesses with a ruthless efficiency that bordered on artistry. He knew the cold, unyielding man, the one forged in the fires of unforgiving streets and hardened by the constant struggle for power. But this soft inquiry, this lingering gaze, this tenderness in the air, however faint, was alien. A shock rippled through Marco, an internal tremor that threatened his composure. The Don, he's really doing this? The thought echoed in his mind, a jarring dissonance against everything he understood about his boss. He couldn't reconcile the image of the feared crime lord with the man currently looking at a small girl with something approaching paternal concern. It was unsettling, a crack in the carefully constructed facade of invincibility, a glimpse into a humanity he hadn't believed existed within Don Rossi. He dare not move, dare not breathe too loudly, afraid to break the fragile spell that had fallen over the room, afraid to interrupt whatever strange, unprecedented transformation was unfolding before him. Don Rossi finally lifted his hand, the 7 crumpled dollars still nestled in his palm. He extended his arm, not dropping them, but offering them back to Sophia, his fingers brushing against hers as he placed the money gently into her outstretched hand. The gesture was deliberate, a quiet declaration. "Your mother will be cared for, Sophia," he said, his voice now a low, conspiratorial murmur, softer than Marco had ever heard it, yet still carrying the implicit weight of an unbreakable promise. "But you will not say a word about this to anyone. Not to your mother, not to your friends, not to anyone. It is our secret. Do you understand?" Sophia's eyes, wide and shimmering with unshed tears of overwhelming relief, fastened onto his. The weight of the $7 in her palm, moments ago a symbol of desperate hope, now felt like a sacred trust. She felt a surge of elation so profound it nearly buckled her knees. He was going to help. Don Rossi, the fearsome man her grandmother warned her about, the man who commanded respect and instilled fear, was going to help her mother. The impossible had happened. Her heart pounded with a mixture of disbelief and fervent gratitude. She nodded, a frantic, emphatic movement of her head, her voice barely a whisper, thick with emotion. "Yes, Mr. Rossi. I promise. Our secret. I won't tell anyone. Ever." The burden of the secret, though heavy, was eclipsed by the tidal wave of hope that washed over her. She would guard this secret with her life, for it held the promise of her mother's recovery, the promise of a future where Isabella could stand tall again. Don Rossi gave a single, almost imperceptible nod, a silent acknowledgement of their pact. His gaze, though returning to its usual intensity, held a flicker of something unreadable, a complex mixture of resolve and perhaps a lingering trace of that distant, painful memory. He made a subtle motion with his hand, a dismissive flick of his fingers in Marco's direction. "Escort the girl home," he commanded, his voice now crisp, back to its familiar, authoritative tone, the brief moment of vulnerability vanishing like smoke. "Ensure she gets there safely. Then return to me." Marco, startled by the sudden return to normalcy, quickly straightened, his initial shock giving way to practiced obedience. He bowed his head slightly. "Yes, Don," he replied, his voice firm though. His mind still reeled. He moved to Sophia's side, his presence a towering shadow next to her small frame. Sophia, clutching the $7 as if they were fragile jewels, felt a renewed surge of energy. She looked up at Marco, her eyes still wide with the enormity of the secret she now carried. He offered her a grim, almost imperceptible nod, a silent confirmation that he, too, was now privy to the Don's unspoken decree. As he gently guided her toward the heavy double doors, Sophia glanced back one last time at Don Rossi, who was already turning his attention to the papers on his desk, his back a formidable, unyielding wall. She carried the same $7 back to her pocket, the same worn bills and quarters, but now they felt entirely different, imbued with a magic she couldn't comprehend, a hope that burned brightly in her small, determined heart. She didn't know how, she didn't know when, but she believed. She believed Don Rossi would keep his word, even if she couldn't fathom the mechanism of his promise. She was propelled by a newfound lightness, a secret joy that made her steps lighter, even as a profound uncertainty lingered, a shadow of the unknown. She was certain of only one thing. Her mother would be okay. Back in the opulent, now silent office, Don Rossi leaned back in his leather chair, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. His eyes were closed for a moment, a fleeting instant where the formidable mask of the crime lord slipped, revealing a flicker of something profoundly human. Then his eyes snapped open, sharp and calculating once more. He rose, walking to the large window that overlooked the rain-slicked city streets, a sprawling dominion of shadows and light. When Marco returned, a few minutes later, the Don was still staring out, his back to the door, a silhouette against the city lights. "Marco," Don Rossi said, his voice devoid of any inflection, any trace of the earlier softness. "I want you to make a few discreet inquiries. Isabella Rossi. Find out everything. Where she works, her doctors, her debts, every detail. Leave no stone unturned. And arrange for a very particular kind of assistance. Nothing overt. Nothing that could be traced back to us or to the girl. Do you understand? It must appear as nothing more than an unexpected turn of good fortune, a series of fortuitous coincidences. No one is to know, absolutely no one, especially not Isabella herself." His voice was low, cutting through the silence like a honed blade, each word a precise instruction, a chillingly efficient command that promised a complex web of unseen interventions, a silent, pervasive influence that would touch lives without ever revealing its source. Marco simply nodded, his face impassive, already formulating the intricate steps required to execute such a delicate and dangerous directive, his mind now firmly back in the familiar, ruthless world of the Don, a world where even compassion could be a weapon, wielded with surgical precision and absolute secrecy. The cold, clinical efficiency of Don Rossi's command vibrated through the hushed office long after Marco had departed, leaving the Don alone once more with the silent, watchful city outside his window. True to the chilling precision of his instruction, the days that followed brought a series of interventions into Isabella Moretti's life, subtle yet profound, like an unseen hand meticulously rearranging the pieces of a desperate puzzle. It began with the arrival of food, not the meager, often stale provisions from a local charity, but vibrant, overflowing baskets left discreetly on her doorstep, often in the dead of night, or during the brief windows when Isabella was at her most vulnerable, stepping out for a doctor's appointment or a rare trip to the pharmacy. One morning, she found a wicker basket filled with plump, sun-kissed tomatoes, glossy bell peppers, crisp lettuce, and a loaf of artisanal bread, still warm to the touch. Another day, it was fresh salmon fillets, gleaming and pink against a bed of ice, alongside a selection of exotic fruits she hadn't seen since her childhood in Italy, succulent figs, ripe persimmons, and grapes bursting with sweetness. Isabella stared at the bounty with a mixture of awe and immediate, biting suspicion. Her apartment, building with its peeling paint and perpetually broken intercom, was hardly a beacon of philanthropic outreach. Who would leave such luxurious provisions for her, a woman teetering on the precipice of ruin? Her pride, a fierce, unyielding thing, immediately flared. She didn't want charity, especially not this kind, delivered with such an unnerving cloak of anonymity. She tried to inquire, asking her neighbors if they had seen anyone, if they knew of any new community programs. Their shrugs and vacant stares only deepened her unease. The baskets kept coming, always fresh, always perfectly timed. Sometimes a small, unassuming package would accompany them, containing new, soft blankets for Sophia, or a brand-new, sturdy pair of shoes that Isabella had been agonizing over for weeks, knowing she couldn't afford them. Each gift was a silent invasion, a reminder that an unknown benefactor knew more about her life, her needs, and her struggles than she cared to admit. Then came the medicine, the expensive, life-saving drugs her doctor had prescribed, the ones that often forced her to choose between buying food and maintaining her tenuous grip on health, began appearing as if by magic. One afternoon, a small, unmarked package was slipped under her door. Inside, nestled in protective foam, were vials of her vital medication, the exact dosage, the correct brand, all with an expiration date far in the future. There were no invoices, no return addresses, just the stark, undeniable presence of what she desperately needed, yet could not afford. Her hands trembled as she held the package, a cold dread seeping into her bones. This wasn't just a random act of kindness. This was calculated, precise, almost surgical in its delivery. Someone knew. Someone was watching. The thought made her skin crawl, even as the desperate part of her, the part that longed for relief from the constant physical pain and the gnawing anxiety of medical debt, felt a treacherous flicker of hope. The next escalation in this mysterious intervention arrived in the form of a woman. Darulina Petrova. She appeared on Isabella's doorstep one crisp afternoon, a woman of elegant bearing with kind, intelligent eyes and a warm, reassuring smile. She introduced herself as a volunteer physician from a newly funded community health initiative, offering complimentary home visits for residents in underserved neighborhoods. Isabella, her guard already bristling, eyed her with deep skepticism. "A volunteer doctor?" she questioned, her voice laced with suspicion. "I haven't heard of any such program. My doctor never mentioned it." Dr. Petrova merely smiled, unperturbed. "It's quite new. Mrs. Moretti, funded by a private donor who prefers to remain anonymous. We're reaching out to families who might benefit from regular medical oversight without the hassle or cost of clinic visits. I understand you have a chronic condition that requires consistent monitoring." Isabella's breath caught in her throat. How did this woman know about her condition? It wasn't public knowledge. Only her closest doctor, Dr. Rossi, no relation, knew the full extent of her ailments. This was too much, too precise, too intrusive. Her pride, already bruised, hardened into a defensive wall. De onde veio tudo isso? Isabella demanded, her voice sharp, cutting through the pleasantries. Eu não pedi nada. Não precisamos de caridade. Her words were a desperate attempt to assert control, to push back against the tide of unsolicited, unnerving generosity. She stood taller, despite the ache in her joints, her eyes blazing with a defiant dignity. She would not be a recipient of handouts, especially not from an unknown, unseen hand that felt more like a puppet master than a benevolent helper. Dr. Petrova, however, met her gaze with a serene calm that only fueled Isabella's frustration. She didn't flinch, didn't falter. Her smile remained gentle, unwavering. Apenas programa. Comunitario, Signora Moretti, the doctor replied, her voice soft, almost soothing. Há muitos anjos por aí. She spoke of anonymous benefactors and a genuine desire to uplift the community. Her words painting a picture of selfless philanthropy. To Dr. Petrova, it was a dream come true. A well-funded initiative allowing her to practice medicine without the suffocating bureaucracy of hospitals or the limitations of under-resourced clinics. She genuinely believed she was part of something good, something truly altruistic. The steady stream of state-of-the-art medical equipment, the readily available supply of expensive medications, the generous stipends for her time, it all pointed to a profoundly compassionate, if unusually discreet, benefactor. She saw herself as a conduit for pure kindness, a small cog in a larger, beautiful machine of anonymous charity. But Isabella was not convinced. Her medical instincts, honed by years of managing her own complex health, told her this was too good to be true, too efficient, too perfectly tailored. Charity, in her experience, was messy, bureaucratic, often demeaning. This was something else entirely. Yet, the help persisted. Dr. Petrova began regular visits, carefully monitoring Isabella's condition, adjusting her medication, providing advice on nutrition and rest. Slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, Isabella's health began to stabilize. The constant pain receded, her energy levels improved, and the dark circles under her eyes, once a permanent fixture, began to lighten. Sophia, a silent observer through it all, watched her mother with an intensity far beyond her years. She saw the baskets of food, the new shoes, the mysterious medicine. She listened to her mother's frustrated outbursts, her fierce declarations of independence. But she also saw the gradual, undeniable improvement in her mother's complexion, the lessening of her cough, the slight spring, returning to her step. Sophia remembered the imposing man with the kind eyes, the man who had taken her $7. She remembered the solemn promise he had made, and a profound understanding settled in her small, brave heart. He was keeping his word. He was helping. One evening, as Isabella rested, a rare moment of peace on her face, Sophia sat beside her, tracing the faint lines on her mother's hand. Isabella was still muttering under her breath about the mysterious benefactors, her brow furrowed in suspicion, but her voice was softer, less desperate. Sophia looked at her mother, then cast her gaze towards the window, where the city lights twinkled like distant stars. In her young mind, a quiet conviction formed. O Don Rossi está agitando, she thought, the words a silent prayer, a secret vow. Ele é anjo. The weight of this secret was heavy, but also strangely comforting. It was her secret, her connection to the man who was quietly, powerfully changing their lives. She knew, with an instinctual certainty, that she must never, ever tell her mother. This was their arrangement, hers and the Don's, a sacred trust forged over $7, and a desperate plea. But for Isabella, the growing relief from the crushing burden of poverty and illness was inextricably linked with a corrosive sense of unease. The constant, anonymous flow of help felt less like a blessing and more like a carefully constructed cage. She felt watched, known, her most intimate struggles laid bare for some unknown entity. Her pride rebelled against the indignity of it all. Yet her body, weakened by years of hardship, found itself craving the relief, the sustenance, the medicine. The food was too good to throw away, the medicine too vital to refuse. Each basket, each package, each visit from the kind but evasive Dr. Petrova felt like a tightening knot, binding her to an obligation she couldn't understand, to a debt she hadn't incurred. The physical improvement in her health was undeniable. She could breathe easier, walk further, and the perpetual cloud of exhaustion had begun to lift. Sophia was happier, better fed, less worried. The apartment felt less cold, less empty. Yet, Isabella felt a cold, hard knot of fear coiling in her stomach. This was too perfect, too seamless. Nothing in her life had ever been this easy, this generous, this efficient without a hidden cost. She was a woman who had fought for every scrap, who had learned the hard way that true kindness was rare and anonymous, expensive charity almost non-existent. Her intuition, a finely tuned instrument of survival, screamed at her that something was profoundly wrong. She felt like a pawn in a game she didn't understand, a recipient of a largesse that carried an unspoken, terrifying price. The suspicion, initially a defensive reflex, had now festered into a deep-seated determination. She needed to know. She needed to uncover the truth behind these mysterious gifts, no matter the risk, no matter the cost. Her quiet, desperate life had been irrevocably altered, and she refused to live in the shadows of an unknown benefactor. She would find out who was pulling the strings, and she would confront them. The days of accepting fate in silence were over. Her quiet, desperate life had been irrevocably altered, and she refused to live in the shadows of an unknown benefactor. She would find out who was pulling the strings, and she would confront them. The days of accepting fate in silence were over. The subtle changes in Sophia were the first clue, tiny threads unraveling the elaborate tapestry of anonymous generosity. Sophia, usually so timid and reserved, now carried a new, almost defiant spark in her eyes. There were new, small toys that appeared, as if by magic, a brightly colored jump rope, a set of worn but beloved wooden blocks. Isabella, her heart clenching with a mixture of tenderness and growing unease, couldn't reconcile these new possessions with their stark reality. They certainly hadn't bought them. The kind women from the church food drive didn't bring toys, only sustenance. Dr. Petrova, for all her evasiveness, was a doctor, not a fairy godmother. The pieces didn't fit, and Isabella's mind, sharpened by years of hardship, began to work tirelessly, piecing together the fragments of an unsettling puzzle. The non-answers piled up, each new item, each small, inexplicable comfort in their otherwise barren existence, brought with it a fresh wave of Isabella's suspicion. A new pair of shoes for Sophia, perfectly sized, appearing by the door one morning. A small, but perfectly ripe apple in Sophia's lunchbox when Isabella knew she hadn't packed one. The girl was too young to be fabricating such tales, too honest by nature to maintain a prolonged deception without cracking. Yet, she was clearly holding something back, a secret she guarded with a fierce, childish loyalty. Isabella watched her daughter with a growing knot in her stomach, observing the way Sophia would sometimes glance nervously at the door or lower her voice when speaking about the gifts. The child's newfound cheerfulness, while a blessing, was also a constant reminder of the uncomfortable questions that gnawed at Isabella's peace of mind. The air in their small apartment grew heavy with Isabella's unspoken questions. The silence between them, once a quiet comfort, now stretched taut and thin, humming with a desperate tension. Isabella found herself scrutinizing Sophia's every move, every innocent gesture, searching for a sign of the truth. Her health continued to improve, the persistent cough now a mere memory, her breath coming easier, her strength slowly returning. But this physical recovery was overshadowed by the growing anxiety that tightened its grip around her heart. She felt like she was living in a beautiful, gilded cage, and she needed to know who held the key. One afternoon, after Dr. Petrova had made her usual swift visit, leaving behind a fresh supply of medication and a new basket of exotic fruits Isabella couldn't afford to buy, Isabella decided she could no longer stand the uncertainty. She watched Sophia play with a set of bright, new crayons, coloring intently in a book that had also mysteriously appeared. The quiet, focused concentration of her daughter, usually a source of comfort, now felt like a barrier. Isabella sat beside her, her gaze firm, her jaw set. "Sophia," Isabella began, her voice low and steady, stripped of its former lightness. "We need to talk. This isn't a game, my love. Mama is very worried." Sophia looked up, her blue eyes wide, a smudge of red crayon on her cheek. The innocent facade began to crumble, replaced by a flicker of fear, a shadow of guilt. "What is it, Mama?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. Isabella took a deep breath, her own heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She couldn't afford to be gentle. Now, the truth, whatever it was, needed to come out. She needed to know who was weaving this web of generosity around them before it became too late to escape. "Sophia, who is sending these things?" Isabella's voice, usually soft and melodic, now carried an unfamiliar edge, a steely firmness that startled even herself. Her eyes, usually filled with gentle affection, were sharp, piercing, demanding an answer. "Me diga a verdade, agora." Tell me the truth now. The command hung in the air, heavy and absolute, stripping away Sophia's last vestiges of childish pretense. The little girl flinched, her small body trembling visibly. Her lower lip began to quiver, and her eyes, usually so bright, welled up with unshed tears. The crayon slipped from her fingers, clattering softly onto the worn floorboards. Sophia buried her face in Isabella's shoulder, her small body racked with sobs. Her words came out in a torrent of gasps and broken syllables, muffled against Isabella's warm blouse. It took Isabella a moment to decipher the fragmented confession, to piece together the terrifying fragments of her daughter's desperate act. "I went to him, Mama. I went to the big man. He was very kind. I gave him my $7 for you, Mama. I told him you were sick. He promised to help." Ugh. Words tumbled out, each one a tiny stone dropped into the deepening pit of Isabella's fear. But it was the name, the single, terrifying name, that finally ripped through the last shred of her composure, freezing the blood in her veins. "I gave my $7 to the Don Rossi. He promised to help." The world tilted. The small apartment, once a haven of quiet struggle, seemed to spin around. Isabella, the walls closing in, the air suddenly thin and sharp, difficult to breathe. The name, Don Rossi, echoed in her mind like a death knell, a cold, predatory whisper. Her hands, still cupping Sophia's face, began to tremble uncontrollably. The horror that washed over her was absolute, suffocating. Don Rossi, not a kindly benefactor from a benevolent charity, not a generous stranger with a sympathetic heart, but the Don Rossi, the name that commanded fear and whispered of dark deeds in every corner of their city, a name synonymous with power, ruthlessness, and an unforgiving network of control. "You did what?" Isabella's voice was a ragged gasp, a strangled cry of disbelief and terror. The words were barely audible, choked off by the sheer magnitude of the revelation. Her eyes, wide with Shock stared at Sophia, but saw only the looming shadow of the man her daughter had so innocently approached. The Don Rossi? My God! The air left her lungs in a whoosh, as if she had been punched in the gut. All the pieces, now horribly clear, crashed down upon her with the force of a tidal wave. The swiftness of the help, the expensive medications, the abundant food, the sudden appearance of Dr. Petrova, whose efficient, unblinking eyes now seemed to hold a sinister quality. It all made horrifying, undeniable sense. Her little girl, her innocent Sophia, armed with $7 meager and a heart full of love, had walked directly into the lion's den. She had approached the most dangerous man in the city, the silent, omnipresent force that held the lives of countless others in his iron grip, and had offered him her childish treasure in exchange for her mother's life. And he had accepted. He had listened. He had acted. The thought sent a fresh wave of nausea through Isabella. This wasn't charity. This was an entanglement, a debt, a dangerous, unspoken contract sealed with a child's desperate plea. A chilling realization clawed at Isabella's throat. She wasn't just receiving help. She was now beholden to a man who took everything. Eventually, nothing was ever truly free with Don Rossi. The stories whispered in hushed tones in the market, in laundromats, in the shadows of dimly lit alleys revolved around his cold, calculating generosity, always with a price far steeper than money. Her daughter had not bought her health back. She had inadvertently bought their servitude, their entanglement in a world Isabella had desperately tried to shield Sophia from. The image of Don Rossi, a phantom in her mind, materialized into something concrete, terrifyingly real. A man whose silent power could crush them as easily as he had orchestrated their salvation. Fear, cold and sharp, lacerated her heart, not just for herself, but for Sophia. What would he demand? In return, what unspeakable favor would be called upon, now that they were under his protection? The thought of Sophia, her bright, innocent eyes, becoming a pawn in the Don's ruthless game was unbearable. Isabella pulled her daughter into a desperate embrace, holding her so tightly it almost hurt, as if she could physically shield her from the monstrous shadow that had fallen over their lives. Sophia, still sobbing, clung to her mother, sensing the profound shift in her demeanor, the new, frantic energy that pulsed from her. Anger flared, hot and sudden, through Isabella's terror. Anger at herself for not seeing it sooner, for allowing herself to be lulled into a false sense of security by the gifts. Anger at Don Rossi for preying on a child's desperation, and a fierce, burning pride, wounded beyond measure. The idea that her daughter had been forced to beg, to offer their last pennies to such a man, was a humiliation that cut deeper than any physical pain. She had always prided herself on her independence, on enduring hardship with dignity, even when her body failed her. Now that dignity lay shattered at the feet of a mafia boss, all because of a child's pure, innocent love. No, this could not stand. She would not be bound. She would not allow her daughter to be bound. A desperate, almost reckless resolve solidified within her. She had to sever ties immediately, unequivocally. She could not accept this help, not if it came with such a terrifying, unspoken cost. Her health, her life, was not worth this kind of dangerous obligation. She would rather struggle, rather face the grim reality of her illness, than become entangled in Don Rossi's web. Isabella gently pushed Sophia away, her hands still trembling, but her eyes now burning with a fierce, almost manic determination. She looked around the small apartment, her gaze falling on the basket of luxurious food on the counter, the bottles of expensive medicine on the table, the new crayons scattered on the floor. Each item, once a symbol of hope, now felt like a chain binding them tighter to a fate she desperately wanted to escape. Her breath hitched in her throat, a raw sound of burgeoning panic. She had to stop it. She had to make it stop. Her mind raced, a whirlwind of frantic thoughts. She would gather everything, every single gift, every pill, every last piece of bread. She would take it all back. She would go to Dr. Petrova, confront her, demand she take back her charity. Or perhaps she would find Don Rossi himself, and somehow, impossibly, return her daughter's $7, along with every single item he had sent, severing the terrifying connection before it could fully ensnare them. It was a desperate, almost suicidal plan, born of terror and wounded pride, but it was the only path she could see. She wouldn't be a debt. She wouldn't be owned. She would reclaim her dignity, no matter the cost, unaware that her every frantic thought, every panicked movement, every desperate attempt to break free was already being observed silently, relentlessly by eyes that saw everything. The frantic determination in Isabella's eyes, the wild energy of her movements as she began to gather the unsolicited gifts, did not go unobserved. Every desperate gesture, every choked breath, every attempt to reclaim a semblance of control was meticulously recorded and reported. The silent watchers, Don Rossi's ever-present network, relayed the unfolding drama with the precision of seasoned chroniclers. From a moment she began to empty the medicine bottles back into their original packaging, to the way she carefully, almost reverently, placed each item of food back into the basket, a detailed account made its way up the chain. They reported her hushed, furious murmurs, her trembling hands, the almost physical repulsion she exhibited towards the very things meant to ease her burden. She had even tried, with a fierce, futile resolve, to deliver a large, heavy envelope back to Dr. Petrova's office, only to be politely, firmly, and unknowingly turned away by an assistant who claimed the doctor was unavailable and could not accept unsolicited packages. The assistant, a young woman with kind eyes, had been instructed to ensure the package remained in Isabella's possession, a subtle reinforcement of the Don's will. The intelligence, distilled into a concise report, landed on Don Rossi's desk hours later. It was late afternoon, the city outside his penthouse office a sprawling canvas of muted grays and browns. Under a sky heavy with the promise of rain, Don Rossi, a man whose presence could fill a room, even when he sat perfectly still, was examining a chessboard, his fingers hovering over a black night. He wore a charcoal suit, impeccably tailored, and the silence of the room was broken only by the faint hum of the city and the occasional rustle of papers as Marco, his consigliere, moved discreetly nearby. Marco, ever efficient, laid out the facts without preamble, his voice low and devoid of emotion, a stark contrast to the tumultuous events he described. "She's refusing it, Don," Marco stated, his eyes meeting Rossi's, a flicker of something akin to bewilderment in their depths. "The woman is trying to return the things. Every last item. The food, the medicine, even the children's toys we sent to Sophia. She doesn't want charity. She even tried to bring a package back to Dr. Petrova's office, a thick envelope, presumably containing the funds we advanced for her treatment, though we intercepted that attempt before it became a public spectacle. It was handled, Don, discreetly, but her message was clear." Don Rossi's gaze remained fixed on the chessboard for a long moment, the unmoving night a silent challenge. His jaw was tight, a muscle ticking subtly near his temple. He had anticipated many reactions, gratitude, fear, perhaps even a shrewd attempt to leverage the situation, but not this. Not outright refusal. Not this burning, unyielding pride that rejected even the most basic assistance. It was an anomaly, a variable he hadn't accounted for, and a faint frustration began to simmer within him, a feeling unfamiliar when his will was concerned. He, Don Rossi, whose every command was met with immediate, unquestioning obedience, whose generosity was accepted as a blessing and his wrath as a judgment, was being defied by a single, impoverished woman. He pushed away from the desk, the soft leather of his chair, sighing in protest. Without a word, he walked to the floor-to-ceiling window that overlooked the sprawling urban landscape. The city, usually a source of detached power, now felt like a backdrop to a personal challenge. He watched the ant-like figures below, lost in their own struggles, and then his eyes narrowed, focusing on a specific, nondescript apartment building several blocks away. He knew which window was hers. He had seen the reports, the photographs, the careful sketches of her daily routine. He had even watched video feeds, carefully edited to capture her most unguarded moments. And now, he watched her directly through the powerful lens of a high-resolution surveillance camera discreetly mounted in a building across the street. The feed projected onto a hidden screen that slid down from the ceiling at his command showed Isabella in her apartment, her back to him, still moving with a restless, almost desperate energy. He saw her pace, a caged animal, her hands running through her hair, her shoulders hunched with a burden heavier than any physical object. He saw her stop, her gaze sweeping over the small, tidy space, landing on the very items she had tried to return, her expression a complex mix of despair and defiant resolve. He could almost feel the heat of her pride radiating even through the cold, impartial lens. She wasn't just refusing charity. She was refusing to be seen as helpless. She was refusing to be indebted. She was fighting for something more profound than mere survival. She was fighting for her very essence, her autonomy. And in that moment, watching her, a strange, unexpected sensation bloomed in Don Rossi's chest. It wasn't anger, not entirely. It was a reluctant respect, a grudging admiration for a spirit so fierce it would rather starve than bend. He had seen many strong individuals in his life, men who faced down bullets without flinching, women who built empires from nothing. But this woman, this Isabella, possessed a different kind of strength, a quiet, unyielding dignity that was both maddeningly inconvenient and profoundly compelling. Marco, sensing the shift in the Don's mood, moved closer. She's not like the others, Don. She doesn't understand the gesture. She sees it as a trap, perhaps, or simply an insult to her self-sufficiency. Maybe it would be best to let it go. We made the offer. If she refuses, we simply move on. There are other ways to ensure Sophia is cared for, if that's your primary concern, without antagonizing the mother. This is becoming an unnecessary complication. Perhaps we should stop. We have done our part, more than anyone else would have done for a complete stranger. His voice was practical, logical, offering a clear path away from an unexpected snag. He was a man of solutions, and sometimes the best solution was to cut one's losses. Don Rossi remained silent for a long moment, his eyes still fixed on the distant, pixelated image of Isabella. The setting sun cast long shadows across the city, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple. He watched Isabella pick up a small, worn photograph, perhaps of her late husband, and press it to her chest, her shoulders shaking almost imperceptibly. He saw the raw vulnerability beneath the layers of defiance, the profound exhaustion that clung to her like a shroud. And he saw something else, too, something that resonated with a forgotten corner of his own hardened heart. A memory, perhaps, of a time when pride was the only currency he had, the only thing that kept him standing. He turned slowly from the window, his gaze sweeping across the room, past Marco, past the untouched chessboard, as if searching for an answer in the very air around him. His eyes, usually cold and calculating, held a flicker of something unreadable, a challenge to himself. She doesn't want charity, Marco, he said, his voice a low rumble, each word deliberate, heavy with conviction. She wants dignity. She wants to earn her way, to stand on her own 2 feet without feeling beholden to anyone, and she's right to demand it. That kind of pride, Marco, it is rare. It is a strength, not a weakness, and it deserves respect, even when it is inconvenient. He paused, a new idea beginning to form in his mind, a complex tapestry woven from frustration, respect, and an unexpected, almost paternal desire to see this woman rise. The previous plan had been too blunt, too overtly philanthropic. It had failed precisely because it stripped her of the very thing she valued most. He needed a different approach, one that would allow her to reclaim her autonomy while still ensuring her daughter's future. It needed to be subtle, indirect, and above all, it needed to be an opportunity, not a handout. Marco waited patiently, his expression unwavering, accustomed to the Don's moments of quiet contemplation, knowing that a new directive was always on its way. He watched as Don Rossi's eyes, once distant, sharpened with a renewed focus, the frustration giving way to a cold, strategic resolve. The chessboard, forgotten for a moment, now seemed to represent the intricate game he was about to play. "We will not stop," Don Rossi continued, his voice firm, leaving no room for argument. "But we will change our strategy. She will not accept charity, so we will offer her an opportunity. An opportunity she can earn, an opportunity that will allow her to care for her daughter without feeling like a beneficiary of anyone's pity or generosity. Something that allows her to look herself in the mirror and know she did it herself." He walked back to his desk, picking up the Black Knight, turning it over in his fingers. "Find her a job, Marco. A real job. Something she can do, something that will provide for her and Sophia, but that doesn't feel like a gift. No strings attached, no hidden expectations beyond her performance. Make it legitimate. Make it appear entirely coincidental. A stroke of luck, a new opening, an anonymous referral. Something she can accept with her pride intact." Marco's eyebrows rose almost imperceptibly. This was a deviation from their usual methods, a level of intricate manipulation far beyond simple coercion or overt assistance. But he understood. The Don had been challenged, and his response was not to withdraw, but to adapt, to overcome the obstacle with a finesse that few could rival. "A job, Don?" Marco asked, just to confirm the unusual request. "What kind of job? And how do we ensure she finds it and accepts it without suspicion?" Don Rossi placed the knight back on the board, his gaze intense. "Her background, Marco. What did our reports say? She worked in administration, clerical tasks, before her husband's illness. She is intelligent, organized, and clearly fiercely dedicated. Find an opening in one of our legitimate N.B. a front office, perhaps a bookkeeping position, anything that requires diligence and discretion. Make sure the compensation is generous, enough to cover her needs and Sophia's medical expenses, but not so extravagant as to raise questions. Create the opening if one doesn't exist, and orchestrate it so that the offer comes to her through an unexpected channel, a friend of a friend, a community notice, a chance encounter that seems entirely fortuitous. Make it an opportunity she can grasp with both hands, an answer to her prayers, rather than a heavy burden of debt." He looked at Marco, his eyes hard, unwavering. "And ensure it is undeniable. An offer so compelling, so perfectly suited to her predicament, that her pride will have no choice but to accept it. Make it real, Marco. Make it her salvation on her own terms." The order hung in the air, a complex challenge. Laid bare, a new game begun, with Isabella's fierce pride as the ultimate prize. Marco took the challenge, not with the usual ruthless efficiency he applied to the Don's more conventional affairs, but with a nuanced precision that bespoke a quiet understanding of the task's true nature. This wasn't about intimidation or leverage. It was about artifice, about creating an illusion of opportunity so perfectly tailored that it would feel like fate. He spent days, not hours, poring over the various legitimate enterprises the Rossi family maintained, the construction firms, the import-export businesses, the restaurant chains, the real estate holdings. He sifted through their organizational charts, their current hiring needs, their projected growth, searching for a gap, A legitimate justification for a new administrative role that could absorb Isabella Moretti without a ripple of suspicion. The Verde Fresco company emerged as the most promising candidate. A small but growing organic produce distribution business, recently acquired by one of the Don's holding companies. Its structure was still fluid, its administrative needs undefined beyond the owner-operator who had sold it. Perfect. Marco envisioned a role, a blend of office management, inventory oversight, and client relations, tasks. Isabella's resume, carefully curated by Marco's discreet inquiries, suggested she was perfectly suited for. The compensation, he ensured, was generous, not ostentatious, but substantial, enough to make a genuine difference in Isabella's life, to lift the crushing weight of medical bills and daily expenses from her shoulders. It was a salary that would allow her to not just survive, but to breathe, to begin to truly heal. His approach to Isabella, however, required the most delicate touch. He couldn't simply appear at her door. That would be too direct, too indicative of the Don's hand. Instead, Marco orchestrated a series of seemingly serendipitous events. He had a contact, a distant cousin of family friend, who volunteered at the same community center where Isabella occasionally sought advice. This woman, Maria, was instructed to mention, casually, that her own daughter had just landed a fantastic administrative job through a new recruitment agency that specialized in placing experienced professionals returning to the workforce. The agency itself was a shell created by Marco, its website and brochures meticulously crafted to appear utterly legitimate, with glowing testimonials for non-existent clients. Isabella, fragile but still fiercely independent, heard Maria's enthusiastic story during quiet afternoon at the community center. She listened, her heart a tangled knot of hope and despair, her pride warring with her desperate need. The idea of a legitimate job, one she could earn, resonated deeply. She took the agency's name, skepticism a constant companion, but a flicker of a forgotten dream igniting in her tired eyes. A few days later, after a deliberately vague interview with a recruiter from this agency, a young lawyer from one of the Don's firms playing a role, Isabella received a call. It was Marco. He had meticulously researched Isabella's daily routine, her preferred coffee shop, the small park where she sometimes sat to gather her thoughts before heading to the clinic with Sophia. He found her there, on a bench, a worn paperback in her hands, her gaze distant as she watched children playing in the autumn leaves. He approached her, not in a dark suit, but in a smart, understated business casual ensemble, a briefcase in hand, projecting an air of professional courtesy, rather than veiled menace. "Mrs. Moretti," he inquired, his voice smooth, devoid of any hint of his true allegiance. He offered a slight, respectful nod. "My name is Marco. I'm an associate with the Verde Fresco company. We recently received a recommendation about your impressive administrative background." Isabella's head snapped up, her eyes narrowing. She clutched the book to her chest, a shield against the unexpected intrusion. "I'm sorry, I don't know any Verde Fresco, and I haven't applied for any jobs recently." Her tone was guarded, weary, a lifetime of hardship making her wary of any sudden, unexpected kindness. Marco offered a polite, almost apologetic smile. "Indeed, we understand you've been through a challenging period. However, our new recruitment agency, which I believe you've been in contact with, brought your profile to our attention. They speak highly of your abilities." And Don Rossi, he paused, letting the name settle in the crisp air, a name that carried weight and unspoken authority. "Also spoke to our CEO directly, singling you out for your exceptional organizational skills and dedication. He suggested we reach out." Isabella's breath hitched. Don Rossi. The name was a whisper of power, of shadowed dealings, of a debt she feared she could never repay. Her mind reeled, trying to reconcile the image of the fearsome mob boss with this seemingly legitimate, almost benevolent intervention. He had done this. He hadn't forgotten. But how? And why? After all this time, after her daughter's desperate plea, he did that. She managed, the words barely a whisper, a genuine spark of wonder tinged with suspicion, lighting her tired eyes. Why? Marco maintained his professional composure, his gaze steady and unwavering. He understood the need for a plausible, pride-preserving explanation. The Don recognizes talent, madam. Nothing more. He believes in giving opportunities to capable individuals, especially those who have demonstrated resilience and integrity in difficult circumstances. Our company is growing, and we require a meticulous, trustworthy administrative manager. Your qualifications are exceptional. We believe you would be an invaluable asset. He delivered the lines with the practiced ease of a man accustomed to navigating complex human emotions, carefully avoiding any suggestion of charity or obligation. He presented her with a sleek, embossed folder containing a detailed job description, a proposed salary, and benefits package that felt impossibly generous for her circumstances. He spoke of growth potential, of a supportive work environment, of a chance to rebuild not just her finances, but her life. Isabella listened, her initial suspicion slowly yielding to a potent mix of disbelief and desperate hope. It was real, too real to be a trick, too perfect to be anything but a dream. The numbers on the page were concrete, the responsibilities clearly defined. It was a lifeline extended in a way that her pride could grasp. I'll need time to consider, she said, her voice still trembling slightly, but now with a nascent excitement, a fragile seed of hope beginning to sprout in the desolate landscape of her heart. Marco nodded, recognizing the delicate balance between eagerness and respect. Of course, take all the time you need, but know that the offer stands. We are very eager to have you join our team. He left her with a business card, a direct line to him, and the promise of a brighter future, a carefully constructed illusion of an opportunity that was, in its essence, a profound act of compassion. Isabella spent the next few days in a whirlwind of cautious optimism and intense scrutiny. She devoured every piece of information she could find about Verde Fresco online. She cross-referenced company registrations, read industry reviews, even drove past their modest but clean and clearly operational distribution center on the outskirts of the city. Every detail was scrutinized, every claim double-checked, everything checked out. The company was legitimate. The job description, challenging but within her capabilities, resonated with her years of experience. The salary, transformative, offered a tangible path out of the abyss. It was an answer to prayers she hadn't even dared to fully articulate, a miracle disguised as a job offer. Her pride, that fierce, unyielding core of her being, found solace in the fact that this was a real job. She wasn't being given charity. She was being offered employment based on her skills, her experience, her own merit. She would earn her own way, provide for Sophia, pay her debts, and reclaim the dignity that poverty had so cruelly stripped away. The thought was intoxicating, filling her with a renewed sense of purpose. With a deep breath and a heart thrumming with a mix of trepidation and exhilaration, Isabella accepted the offer. The first day, she walked into the Verde Fresco offices. Her shoulders were a little straighter, her step a little lighter, a faint, almost forgotten smile playing on her lips. She had earned this. She had earned her salvation, or so she believed, and that belief was everything. Meanwhile, in the hushed, sterile environment of Dr. Petrova's clinic, a different kind of progress was being meticulously recorded. Dr. Petrova, a woman of science and keen observation, had noted a remarkable stabilization in Isabella's health. The rapid decline had halted, and now a slow, steady improvement was evident. The dark shadows beneath Isabella's eyes, once deep hollows of exhaustion and worry, had begun to recede. Her skin, once sallow and taut with stress, now held a healthier glow. Her voice, no longer raspy with fatigue, carried a clearer, more resilient tone during their checkups. She even noticed a subtle change in Isabella's posture, a release of the tension that had previously held her shoulders perpetually hunched. "Your numbers are looking excellent, Isabella," Dr. Petrova remarked during one such appointment. Her gaze warm and approving as she held up Isabella's latest blood test results. "The treatment is certainly working wonders, but I also see something else. A significant reduction in stress markers. Are things improving at home?" Isabella, with a genuine smile that reached her eyes, a smile Dr. Petrova hadn't seen in months, nodded. "Yes, doctor. Remarkably so. I found a job. A wonderful administrative position with a company called Verde Fresco. It's been life-changing. I finally feel like I can breathe again." The words were spoken with such heartfelt relief that Dr. Petrova felt a quiet satisfaction. Dr. Petrova scribbled notes on her chart, a knowing, almost subtle gleam in her eyes. The medical profession often saw the profound impact of socioeconomic factors on health. Stress, financial insecurity, the constant worry, these were potent poisons. Relief, hope, purpose, these were powerful medicines, often more effective than any pharmaceutical. She had seen it countless times, the way a patient's recovery could stall or accelerate based on their life circumstances. It wasn't just the medication. It was the entire ecosystem of Isabella's life that had shifted. The body, when given the chance, possessed an astonishing capacity for healing, and Isabella was proving that capacity beautifully. Sophia, ever observant, witnessed her mother's transformation with a quiet, profound joy that illuminated her own small world. She saw the renewed energy in Isabella's steps, the lighter tone in her voice, the way her mother hummed softly as she prepared their meager meals, a forgotten habit, now returned with a gentle warmth. She saw the new, crisp clothes Isabella wore to work away. She spoke with enthusiasm about her tasks, about the people she met, about the simple pleasure of earning her own way. Her mother was coming back to life, piece by piece, day by day, like a wilting flower slowly regaining its vibrancy. The mystery of the $7, the impossible promise, had subtly, elegantly resolved itself. Don Rossi hadn't simply handed them cash, a gesture that would have wounded Isabella's pride and haunted Sophia with a sense of unpayable debt. Instead, he had orchestrated an opportunity, a path for Isabella to regain her footing, to earn her own salvation. He had honored her mother's dignity, even as he extended his formidable protection. Sophia understood. He hadn't just helped them, he had empowered them. He had kept his word in a way that left no room for question, no trace of obligation, only the quiet, undeniable warmth of a promise profoundly fulfilled. The secret, a silent understanding of the Don's intricate compassion, now rested not just in Sophia's small, wise heart, but also, in its own way, in Isabella's newfound peace, a peace built on a foundation of honest work and renewed hope, a future woven into the fabric of Verde Fresco, where she truly believed she was earning her own way, unaware of the quiet, powerful hand that had so carefully woven the threads of her destiny. Months folded into weeks, weeks into a seamless tapestry of new beginnings. The air in Isabella's lungs felt cleaner, lighter, imbued with a fresh clarity that had been absent for so long. Her cough, once a persistent, hacking torment, had softened into a rare, almost shy clearing of her throat. A vestige of a past she was rapidly leaving behind. The color had returned to her cheeks, a warm, natural flush, and the hollows beneath her eyes, once dark and bruised with perpetual worry, had smoothed out, replaced by a quiet, steady light. She moved with a newfound grace, a vitality that flowed through her limbs, propelling her forward not with frantic desperation, but with the measured confidence of someone who had reclaimed their strength. At Verde Fresco, she was no longer just a new hire finding her footing. She was an indispensable part of the team, her hands moving with practiced efficiency as she arranged the vibrant produce, her voice a calm, reassuring presence for customers. She greeted them by name, remembered their preferences, and offered genuine smiles that reached her eyes, reflecting the profound peace that had settled within her. She spoke with enthusiasm about the quality of the organic tomatoes, the crispness of the lettuce, the sweet scent of ripe peaches, her words painting vivid pictures of freshness and abundance. She talked about her colleagues, about the satisfying rhythm of her tasks, about the simple, profound pleasure of earning her own way, of providing for her daughter with dignity. Every coin in her purse, every bill in her wallet felt like a testament to her resilience, a tangible symbol of her hard-won independence. Their new apartment, smaller than some might desire, felt like a palace to them. It was bathed in natural light, a cheerful cascade that poured through the freshly cleaned windows, illuminating the pale yellow walls and the simple, sturdy furniture Isabella had carefully chosen. There were no creaking floorboards, no ominous shadows lurking in corners, no chill that seeped into their bones. The building itself felt solid, secure, its corridors clean and well-lit, the laughter of children echoing from other apartments, a comforting melody instead of a jarring disturbance. Sophia had a small room, all to herself, a sanctuary where her drawings of fantastical creatures and vibrant landscapes adorned the walls, a kingdom built on imagination and the boundless joy of childhood. She no longer startled at every unexpected sound, no longer clung to her mother's hand with a desperate grip. Her laughter, once a rare, fragile sound, now bubbled up freely, unrestrained and pure, echoing through their cozy home. She played in the park without a shadow of worry, her small legs a blur as she chased after friends, her face alight with a carefree exuberance that had been stolen from her for too long. The burden of her mother's illness, the gnawing anxiety of their poverty, had lifted, leaving behind a child who was finally, gloriously, just a child. One warm afternoon, months after the extraordinary encounter that had reshaped their lives, Sophia walked hand in hand with her mother through a bustling piazza. The sun warmed her hair, the scent of fresh bread and blooming jasmine perfumed the air, and the distant melody of an accordion filled the space with a joyful hum. Sophia's eyes, bright and curious, scanned the faces in the crowd, taking in the vibrant tapestry of daily life. And then, amidst the stream of people, she saw him. Don Rossi. He stood near the entrance of a quiet cafe, a dark, imposing figure even from a distance, surrounded by men who moved with the same quiet deference that she remembered. His silver hair caught the light, his sharp eyes, usually so unyielding, were for a fleeting moment turned towards the piazza, towards the laughter and the life unfurling before him. Sophia paused, a small, involuntary halt in her step. Her heart gave a curious little lurch, a flutter of recognition, not of fear, but of something deeper, more complex. She didn't point, didn't whisper, didn't even tug on her mother's hand. She simply stood, a tiny sentinel in the vibrant crowd, and met his gaze across the expanse of the piazza. For a beat, a long, drawn-out moment that stretched and thinned the air between them, their eyes locked. His dark and fathomless held hers wide and clear. There was no overt acknowledgement. No wave. Just a silent, profound understanding that passed between the fearsome Dawn and the little girl who had offered him everything she had. And then it happened. A subtle shift in the hard lines of Don Rossi's face. The corner of his mouth, just barely, almost imperceptibly, lifted. A small, fleeting, almost shy smile, a whisper of a human emotion, a crack in the formidable mask he wore for the world. It was gone as quickly as it appeared, swallowed by the stoic professionalism. That was his second nature, but Sophia saw it. She felt it, a warmth spreading through her chest. A silent validation of a kindness she knew existed, even in the most shadowed corners. She offered him no smile in return, only a steady, knowing look, and then, as if drawn by an invisible thread, she turned and continued walking with her mother, her hands still clasped in Isabella's, the warmth of the sun and the memory of that quiet smile, a precious secret held close to her heart. In the opulent silence of Don Rossi's private office, amidst the dark wood and rich leather, the framed $7 sat on his massive, polished desk. It wasn't hidden away in a drawer, nor relegated to a discreet corner. It was prominently displayed, right next to the antique globe and the stack of financial reports, a stark, almost defiant splash of unexpected sentimentality in a room, designed for power and cold calculation. The worn, crumpled bills, now carefully flattened and preserved behind glass, were a constant, undeniable reminder of that rainy afternoon, of the small, fierce girl with her desperate plea, and of the unexpected humanity that had stirred within him. He often found himself gazing at it, his fingers idly tracing the smooth, cool glass, his thoughts drifting back to Sophia's unwavering resolve, her innocent, heartbreaking faith. It had become more than just a memento. It was a touchstone, a silent confessor, a symbol of a different kind of currency, one that transcended ledgers and power plays. Marco, his most trusted consigliere, entered the office one afternoon, bearing a stack of documents related to a new real estate venture. He paused, as he often did, his gaze falling upon the framed bills. He had seen the Don look at them before, a thoughtful, almost wistful expression on his face. That was rarely, if ever, seen by anyone else. Today, however, Don Rossi spoke of it aloud, his voice a low rumble that filled the quiet room. He leaned back in his chair, his eyes fixed on the framed currency. $7, Marco, he said, the words heavy with an inflection that was not quite regret, not quite pride, but something in between, a quiet introspection. It changed more than millions ever changed for me. He paused, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes, a shadow of an old memory, a glimmer of a new understanding. Marco, a man of few words but profound insight, simply nodded, his gaze lingering on the worn bills. Sometimes, Don, he replied, his voice equally measured, the smallest things have the greatest value. He understood. He had witnessed the subtle shifts in Don Rossi's approach to certain situations, a newfound, almost imperceptible tempering of his ruthlessness, a quiet consideration for the unseen ripple effects of his decisions. He wouldn't call it softness, not for a man like Don Rossi, but it was certainly a different perspective, a human one. Don Rossi held Marco's gaze for a long moment, a silent acknowledgement passing between them. He then turned back to the framed bills, a faint, almost imperceptible smile playing on his lips, mirroring the one Sophia had witnessed in the piazza. He understood the irony, the profound truth in Marco's words. The world of millions had hardened him, built an empire of fear and respect. But $7, offered with a child's pure heart, had cracked open a window, letting in a sliver of light he hadn't known he desperately needed. And so, life continued to unfold in the vibrant, sprawling city. The seasons cycled, the sun continued its generous embrace, and the stories of countless lives intertwined and diverged. But the small, audacious action of a little girl, a mere $7 offered with innocent desperation, continued to ripple outward. Its subtle echoes felt far beyond the confines of a single family. Isabella thrived, her laughter a testament to resilience, her hands building a new, stable life for herself and her daughter. Sophia blossomed, her spirit unburdened, her eyes holding the quiet wisdom of a child who had seen darkness and found an unexpected light. And Don Rossi, the feared and respected patriarch, carried the legacy of those $7 within him. It didn't transform him into a saint, nor did it erase the complex, often brutal realities of his world, but it had etched a new perspective into his hardened soul, a quiet understanding that even in the pursuit of power there was room for an unexpected, profound humanity. The little girl's faith had touched a heart believed to be impermeable, proving that kindness, however small and from whatever source, could leave a silent, enduring mark, weaving threads of redemption into the darkest fabric of destiny. A bittersweet, hopeful testament to the enduring power of innocence.